we've already seen some from platform, which are the informative persuasive speeches. We saw some examples of oral interpretation of literature. And then we're going to shift gears again, and we're going to start to talk a little bit about limited preparation events. And I'm going to hand it over to Brandon Neary from Palomar College, who will briefly explain what the limited preparation events are. If you turn on your cell phone during break, would you please double check and make sure that those are turned off, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Steffi.
He's the only one that called me that.
That's not true. Alrighty. For a little bit of a change of pace, the next two events that you see are short preparation events. These are a little different from the other things that you'll see today. First, because you don't get a lot of time at all to work on. You may spend months working on a duo, months working on a platform speech, but short prep's a little more on the fly than that. The first type of short prep speech which you'll be seeing is called an impromptu speech. And for this type of speech, you have 7 minutes to design and deliver a speech regarding usually a set of quotations that you'll be handling. So how it works is the person who's doing it will receive a list of quotations. They'll choose one, and then they'll get started thinking very, very rapidly, because the more time you spend preparing, the less time you have in order to give your speech. And these are fun, partly because they train you in order to be able to operate without maybe as much of a plan or as much preparation as you might want in some of the other events. But it's also different because every single speech that you give will be entirely unique. You will never give the same speech twice, and we as critics will, hopefully, never see the same speech. So that helps keep things a little more unpredictable for everybody who's involved. The other neat thing about impromptu especially is that once you have that quotation and it gets you started and in the direction of the speech that you want to do, it's basically 7 minutes of you time. So you can do that speech however you want, talk about whatever is interesting to you, bring your unique knowledge and the stuff that you're interested in into that round. And I think that that's a really valuable opportunity for you to have the chance to talk about what you want to talk about. So, without any further ado, we'll introduce today's presenter. It's my very, very distinct pleasure to introduce Francesca Smith here from Stanford University, who is not only a multiple gold medalist in impromptu, but also the winner of the 2004 Bavaro Award, which means best at nationals, period. So, we'll run this exactly like a normal round. Here's the list of quotations. We'll give them out, and then we'll start calling off prep time. Now, there is one favor that I will ask you, because the time you have to prepare your speech is probably the shortest minute and 20 seconds in your entire life. I am going to ask you to remain quiet as the audience, because this is hard enough to do without having to cut through 100 conversations. All set? All right. Time begins. Seconds used. One minute used.
I remember one of the most profound moments of my young life. It happened, I don't know, I'd say I was probably about 16 years old, and I was sitting on the porch talking to my mom. Quaint, right? But instead of having the usual mother-daughter lecture where she would just tell me her opinion on something and expect me to just accept her viewpoint, she actually turned around and asked me a question. Now, this moment kind of came as a shock to me because it's my mom, right? She's supposed to know everything in the universe. Or at least that's what she's told me since I was a little kid. But at this moment, I realized that she respected my opinion enough to actually value what I had to say. And you know what? That made me feel pretty wonderful. And I think it's something that, incidentally, someone who's entirely unlike my mother commented with respect to Tupac. Tupac said something that I believe is very wise. Even the genius asks questions. And you know what? It might not necessarily always be true, because there are probably a lot of people who think they're so smart they don't need to ask questions. I think just for a few minutes, we should believe this as true, because I think it's something that very much should be applied in our everyday lives. No matter how smart you think you are, you can always stand to gain some sort of new knowledge. So hold your horses for a minute, take a step back, and realize that there is something for each of us to learn, no matter how bright or brilliant we may seem to be. So in order to look at the idea of why we must continually be asking questions, I think there are a couple of theoretical frameworks that we can use in order to better understand this, particularly looking first to Fisher's model. Secondly, however, it's not very useful if we have a theoretical framework of why something might be true unless we've seen it applied in the real world. So let's look at a couple of empirical examples, first in the political realm, but secondly moving into an educational style that I think is pretty cool. So looking first at philosophy and Walter Fisher. Okay, so Fisher was a pretty smart guy, right? And in 1981, he proposed this three-part model for how we interpret the world. Two of them don't really matter. The one I want to talk about is the naive scientist model. Now, what he proposed is that in the naive scientist model, we always want to have an answer for everything. And, well, this may be true of little kids, for example, who never seem to shut up with the questions. I think it's actually true the older you get as well. We always want to understand the way the world around us works. This fits in very nicely with schema theory, proposed by Wicks in 1991, who suggested that the only way that we can really make sense of the entire world is to have some sort of schemata, in plural, or framework, in which way we can better interpret what to expect in certain situations and how we ought to behave. So for example, if you've never been on an airplane before, you're a little scared, right? But after the first time you get on that airplane and you know, hey, I'm going to get free peanuts, there might even be a really good movie. You might build a little bit better repertoire of how to act the next time you get on that airplane. So if you take Fisher's idea of how we always want to explore the world around us, combine this with schemata theory, we understand that the best way we have to interpret the world is via asking questions. I think Tupac, incidentally, agreed with two people he's probably never met. However, even if we continually ask these questions in our own mind, it doesn't really make much sense unless we've seen it applied in the larger world as a whole, right? So I think there are a few ways that we can go about talking about this. And I think the very crux of the democratic principle is an excellent illustration of this. The idea that we must continually have panels of intellectual debate, well, hopefully intellectual, in order to better understand what the best possible decisions are for us. Now sure, I could talk about the hackneyed examples of the US Congress and all that, but I'm going to pick a slightly cooler one. In Antigua. Now Antigua had this rather oppressive governmental structure put in place by Britain as one of their colonies. But they didn't just leave it there. They continually asked questions saying, is this really what's going to give us the best possible experience as a country, having this oppressive government from Britain constantly telling us what to do? They continually asked questions and eventually decided it wasn't the best alternative for them. So they took over and made their own government. Now they kept some of the things that Britain had in place, but they continually questioned the status quo. And even though they may have been doing all right under Britain's rule, they took Tupac's advice, ironically enough, and continued to ask questions until they had the best possible government. The final example, however, is one that I think we see in our everyday lives, in terms of the Socratic method. Now, maybe not every one of your teachers uses job with no one in there, you're not doing a very good job, because the teacher must learn from the students just as much, regardless of how much of a genius they may seem like. Okay, so I'm not saying that I'm any sort of genius, but I remember how important it was when I was asked a question by my mother for the first time, and when I, in turn, turned around and asked her more questions, because it gave me a better schema, or a better way to experimentally figure out the world. But then, even if I'm not applying this in government, it made my life a much better place. So take a moment the next time you think you just might know everything. Step back and ask a few questions to follow up with you.
That took 1 minute and 22 seconds for her to come up with. Now, do you have any questions? Stuff you'd like to know? Certainly, Josepher.
So you had 3 quotations. Like, what made you choose that one out of the 3? Like, what formula did you
It
go
was the
through?
shortest. No, actually, the second one was a little bit complex, and I wanted to pick something that I thought I could really give a lot of analysis to without having to spend a lot of time just explaining what the quotation meant. And the other one I didn't really agree with terribly much, but I thought this one was something that I felt passionately about as being true, and had some ideas as to why it was true.
One of the things that Impromptu teaches there is fast decision making. If you're looking at your quotations and you're like, 30 seconds later, you're still like, something is going terribly wrong. So, as a general rule, you do want to make your decisions quickly when you're presented with these options, because that gives you more time to think about what you're doing. And because your preparation time for this is so short, those extra 15 seconds may mean the difference between you knowing what's going on and you doing sort of a little soft chew and ad-libbing something. Yes, Rob.
I have been doing this event starting Stanford, but I think maybe for the newer people you could explain how sometimes people do 3 bodies and how sometimes they do a 2-by-2 structure difference.
Basically, most of you have at least some exposure to public speaking in the form of maybe a basic public speaking class or at very least a 7th grade English class. Notice how the structure that's going here follows the same basic form as a 5-paragraph thesis structured essay. You see how that flows through the speech? There's an introduction, talking about talking to mom, talking about the quotation in its thesis statement and what it says, and then a number of examples which either back up the point you're talking about or demonstrate why the quotation is wrong. So that basic structure, even though it's an impromptu speech, follows the same 5-paragraph thesis structured essay that you've been working with since you were in 7th grade English and probably trying really hard not to pay attention. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed you didn't write anything down. Have you always just not written anything down, or did you just use a card?
No, the way I was coached was just do it without a card. Makes
I
it easier. A lot of people, while they're prepping, are very visual learners, so they feel the need to write a couple of notes. It kind of distracts me, and I don't know, it's a little cleaner without me.
So certainly, that's a matter of personal choice. Note that for most people, they'll want to at least write something down so that they can look at it, and then later on, when they're trying to remember what the structure of their speech is, they may have an opportunity to glance at it and see where you're going. But either because that's not the way that your learning works, or because you're just too good to be delayed by such things, there are a number of different choices that people make as far as whether they write stuff down. We've probably got time for about 3 more questions before we move on to the next event. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed your source was Fisher. Do you basically have one source that you use for most of these, or do you have, or just a book of knowledge and you just know a lot of quotes?
Well, first of all, Impromptu doesn't necessarily have to have citations in terms of, a specific author or a specific year. However, you do use examples. So what that means is you can draw on anything you've ever learned in your class. Like, for example, I had a lecture on Tuesday that talked about Fisher. Yay! But that isn't necessarily something that I would use in a lot of different speeches. Just in this particular one that talked about why asking questions is important, it was relevant. However, if I had a topic on money being the root of all evil, I might use a different theory that talks about how we're consistently driven by economic greed or something like that. So I would use something that's directly applicable to the quotation. The best advice I can give with respect to that is have a little notebook or some sort of computer file, some way you can write things down, and every time you learn about a theory or hear about a cool example or an event in history or any person, just jot down a little bit about them because they will likely be useful in some impromptu sometimes.
And if you're curious about that or you're not sure where that file of information is, open up your class notes. You do take the class notes, right? In other words, you've already carefully taken down a bunch of details about various theorists, stuff that happened in history, art, sociology, the way that life works, examples of good ideas that blew up horribly in someone's face. And every person has a different set of knowledge about that based on what classes you've taken, what your various interests are, and what you like to talk about. So one of the neat things about doing impromptu is the chance to watch 6 different people interpret different sets of quotations, and sometimes, depending on what style it is, everyone in the entire round will have the same 2 quotations, and they'll all have such wildly different takes on it that it keeps everything very interesting. So unless you have a photographic memory, usually what you do is you use your class notes and other just interesting things that you've written down or studied in order to generate those examples. Yes, ma'am?
Do you always have to talk in favor of the quotation, or have you ever spoken against it?
Personally, I have spoken against it a few times. It tends to be the vast majority, at least from what I've seen, that I speak in favor of it, because usually those guys are a little smarter than me, so I figure they've got something right to say. But it certainly is possible, and in a lot of cases very, very valid to disagree, as long as you provide some sort of justification as to why it's not true. If you've got the analysis, you can go whichever way you want.
And that sort of dovetails into that it's you time part of the conversation. I don't know, what do you think about it? And that can then become the basis for whatever sort of speech you want to run. Francesca, I'd say, would normally agree with the quotation because she's generally a pleasant person. But a lot of people find it far easier to destroy than create. And in that way, sometimes it's far easier, especially when you're getting started, to find fault with the quotation rather than to agree with it. And if you're not sure whether it's easier to destroy or create, ask our current administration, and I'm sure they'll have a couple of hints for you. One last question. Yes, sir?
What do you do in your prep time? Do you try to memorize the structure or close it? What exactly do you do?
Well, the first thing you do is read the quotation. That's a good place to start. And then think about what the quotation means to you. And from there, you think about the way you want to analyze it, what your main argument is going to be. Generally, for me, I tend to use a 3-part structure. So I think about sort of logically how I want to break it down into 3 categories. If you use a 2x2, obviously that'll be a little bit different. Think about your examples, and I would just memorize the keywords. Like for that, I would think about, okay, the naive scientist and Fisher, and then democracy in Antigua, and Socratic method. Then the last thing you want to do is come up with your introduction as a general rule. I mean, if you think of an introduction first, great, but you want to get the meat of your speech kind of thought out, and then just run through those keywords right before you speak.
Before we go, I did want to point out a couple of things about the speech specifically. First, notice how at the very beginning of the speech, she lays out the quotation and then takes a second to discuss what this quotation is and what it means. That's very, very useful because a lot of times, depending on the quotation and how artsy the wording is, it can be very difficult to just hear it and figure out exactly what the author was getting at. And depending on how adventurous the Impromptu Topic Committee is feeling, that can get more and more important if your quote isn't, say, a single quotation that makes sense from Tupac, and instead they give you, say, a stuffed animal or a fortune cookie, or in one particularly egregious case, half a page from the book of Leviticus, in order to try and figure out what you're doing. Also, notice how the quotation comes back throughout the entire speech. It's not enough to mention the quotation, say what it means, and then be like, whee, let's talk about something else for a while. At the end of every point, there was a small space where she was like, all right, look, this is what we were talking about, and here's how this underlines Tupac's message or helps sort of explain what he was thinking about. And then, just like you saw in the other platforms or in the 5-paragraph thesis structured essay, the introduction and the conclusion pair with each other. So we started by hearing about Francesca's mom, went around talking about Tupac for a while, and then ended on the same terms. So all of that I thought was very well done. Also, notice how fluent the delivery is. And even if you're not sure what's going to happen next or what's going to come out of your mouth, one of the things that Impromptu does is it teaches you smoothness. And one of the ways that makes it easier for that to happen is when you slow down your delivery a little bit. If any of you have done some studying on that, you notice how when people are under pressure in a public speech, they tend to speed up, and then they go faster and faster, and the quicker they go, the less time they have to think what's coming out of their mouth next because there's less space, and then they have to speed up even more because they're getting even more nervous, and then it just starts getting kind of giant nonsense. You sound like an auctioneer or a parley debater who's spread out in the PMR. So one of the things that she's doing very well there is keeping a nice conversational pace of delivery. Because if you maintain a pace of about this fast, that makes it much easier for you to think of what you're going to say next, and it keeps your speech from sounding rehearsed. So all of those I thought were very, very good things. Now there's one other thing I'd like to mention, and this really is sort of a note. In this case, Francesca happened to have a very good example which ties into her own personal experience and something that happened in her family. If you have a really, really good example of that, then that's acceptable. But as a general rule, you want to try and stay away from talking about stuff that happens at that specific personal level, because in a lot of cases, that's very, very easy to counterfeit, or to have that come out in a way that's not what you're expecting, or to have the judge look on that as something that's less good. So that's really the only thing that I would suggest that could maybe be improved on in this presentation is, as a general rule, you try and stay away from using personal examples to introduce or conclude, unless you have a very, very good one that's appropriate to this topic. Alrighty?